When you think of the Mafia, images of flashy crime bosses, violent shootouts, and headlines probably come to mind. But there's one Mafia you've probably never heard of, and that's exactly how they like it. The Ndrangheta, based in the remote hills of Calabria, Italy, has quietly built the most profitable cocaine pipeline in Europe, all while staying almost completely invisible. Today we're diving into the secret world of the Ndrangheta and how they took over Europe's cocaine trade without anyone noticing. In the remote hills of Calabria, a region in southern Italy where olive groves stretch for miles and small towns cling to mountainsides, there exists a secretive network that has quietly shaped the global cocaine trade. Few outsiders have ever glimpsed the true extent of its power, yet its influence reaches every corner of Europe and even South America. This network is the Ndrangheta, a mafia unlike any other, defined by its invisibility, patience, and meticulous control over every operation it undertakes. Unlike the flashy criminal organizations portrayed in movies, the Ndrangheta has mastered the art of operating in the shadows, allowing it to grow steadily without attracting the scrutiny of law enforcement or the media. To understand how they achieved this, one must first look at their origins and the social structure that has allowed them to maintain such extraordinary cohesion over generations. Calabria is a land of poverty and isolation, and in the 19th century, the harsh conditions bred a culture of tight-knit family clans. The Ndrangheta emerged in this environment, rooted in loyalty, secrecy, and a strict code of conduct. Unlike other criminal groups that sought rapid expansion and visibility, the Ndrangheta preferred a slower, more methodical approach. Its members were bound by blood and marriage, creating a network so intertwined that betrayal was nearly impossible, and outsiders found it difficult to penetrate. This structure became their greatest strength, allowing them to expand internationally while maintaining the core secrecy that has defined them for over a century. By the late 20th century, the world's appetite for cocaine was growing, and the Ndrangheta recognized an unprecedented opportunity. They had no intention of engaging in petty crime or local rackets. Their ambitions were global. This structure became their greatest strength, allowing them to expand internationally while maintaining the core secrecy that has defined them for over a century. By the late 20th century, the world's appetite for cocaine was growing, and the Ndrangheta recognized an unprecedented opportunity. They had no intention of engaging in petty crime or local rackets. Their ambitions were global. They established contacts in South America, cultivating relationships with Colombian and Peruvian cartels. These connections were built slowly, often taking years to develop trust, and relied heavily on personal guarantees and mutual benefit. Unlike other criminal groups that flaunted violence to assert dominance, the Ndrangheta relied on discretion. Their emissaries traveled under the radar, blending in. Ndrangheta operates like a sovereign entity, controlling its own territory, resources, and connections. Yet all families adhere to a shared code of conduct. Marriages between families are strategic, strengthening alliances and ensuring loyalty across generations. Children are often groomed from a young age to understand the network, learning both the business and the necessity of secrecy. This deep-rooted familial loyalty makes infiltration extraordinarily difficult. Law enforcement agencies around Europe have repeatedly attempted to dismantle the Ndrangheta, but success has been limited. Arrests of individual members rarely lead to disruption of the larger network because knowledge is compartmentalized. Most members know only what is necessary for their specific role, whether managing shipments, laundering money, or handling logistics. This means that even when most members know only what is necessary for their specific role, whether managing shipments, laundering money, or handling logistics. This means that even when someone is arrested, they cannot expose the full operation. The Ndrangheta also understood the importance of blending legitimate businesses with criminal operations. Investments in construction, restaurants, import-export firms, and even is arrested, they cannot expose the full operation. The Ndrangheta also understood the importance of blending legitimate businesses with criminal operations. Investments in construction, restaurants, import-export firms, and even local politics provide cover for laundering billions of euros in drug profits. These businesses serve multiple purposes. They generate legitimate income, create influence in communities, and act as a shield against scrutiny. Local politics provide cover for laundering billions of euros in drug profits. These businesses serve multiple purposes. They generate legitimate income, create influence in communities, and act as a shield against scrutiny. Mundane goods from fruit to machinery are often used to hide cocaine, and distribution networks in cities like Milan, Rotterdam, and Duisburg ensure that the product reaches street-level dealers with remarkable efficiency. The economic impact of their operations is staggering. Analysts estimate that the Ndrangheta generates billions of euros annually from cocaine alone, with profits reinvested into both criminal and legitimate enterprises. This wealth allows them to influence local politics, corrupt officials, and maintain a social presence in Calabria that blends philanthropy with intimidation, creating a paradoxical loyalty among locals. Violence, while present, is selective. The Ndrangheta does not seek headlines through public assassinations or media attention. Instead, enforcement occurs quietly and only when necessary to protect the network. This restraint is part of their genius. By avoiding unnecessary attention, they prevent large-scale law enforcement operations from targeting them, allowing the organization to grow steadily and silently. The international dimension of their operations is equally impressive. Through contacts in South America, they control supply chains that rival those of traditional cartels. Their agents negotiate directly with producers, arrange shipping, and coordinate with European distributors with remarkable efficiency. Unlike other organizations, they prioritize reliability and long-term partnerships over immediate gain. This patience has allowed them to dominate markets while competitors falter under pressure either from law enforcement or internal discord. Over the past 2 decades, the Ndrangheta's influence has extended beyond Europe. Their networks touch South America, Africa, and even parts of Asia, where they facilitate both the movement of cocaine and the laundering of profits through complex financial channels. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and investments in real estate create layers of obfuscation, making detection incredibly challenging. Even in Italy, where authorities are familiar with mafia structures, the Ndrangheta remains elusive. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia, whose high-profile arrests have often made headlines, the Ndrangheta's low-profile approach has kept them largely insulated from public scrutiny. Their strategy relies not on intimidation of the public, but on invisibility, patience, and meticulous planning. Understanding the Ndrangheta requires a shift in perspective. They're not flashy criminals seeking fame or notoriety. They are long-term strategists building an empire that spans continents and generations. Every decision from arranging marriages to coordinating shipments is made with the goal of maintaining secrecy and control. This approach has allowed them to thrive where other criminal organizations have faltered. The human cost of their operations, while often hidden from public view, is significant. Communities dependent on their influence face a paradox of fear and loyalty, while European cities experience the societal effects of widespread cocaine use. Law enforcement faces an uphill battle as dismantling one part of the network rarely affects the whole, and the financial power of the Ndrangheta enables them to adapt quickly to new threats. Every decision from arranging marriages to coordinating shipments is made with the goal of maintaining secrecy and control. This approach has allowed them to thrive where other criminal organizations have faltered. The human cost of their operations, while often hidden from public view, is significant. Communities dependent on their influence face a paradox of fear and loyalty, while European cities experience the societal effects of widespread cocaine use. Law enforcement faces an uphill battle as dismantling one part of the network rarely affects the whole, and the financial power of the Ndrangheta enables them to adapt quickly to new threats. In examining the Ndrangheta, it becomes clear that their success is no accident. It is the result of centuries of cultural conditioning, strategic thinking, and the ruthless. In examining the Ndrangheta, it becomes clear that their success is no accident. It is the result of centuries of cultural conditioning, strategic thinking, and the ruthless roots remained firmly planted in Calabria. Their ambitions were never confined to the hills and villages of southern Italy. As their organization matured, so did their understanding of opportunity. They recognized that Calabria could never provide the wealth or influence they sought. The region was poor, isolated, and politically fragile. But across the sea in South America, entire nations were being reshaped by a booming cocaine industry. If then Ndrangheta could position itself not as a middleman, but as a direct bridge between the producers and the European market, then they could control an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. And so began their quiet expansion beyond Italy's borders, an expansion that transformed them from a regional mafia into a global power. Unlike other criminal organizations that relied on sudden bursts of violence or dramatic power grabs, the Ndrangheta advanced silently, embedding themselves into port cities, financial centers, and trade hubs across Europe. Germany became one of their most significant strongholds, especially in industrial regions where Italian immigrant communities had already taken root. From places like Duisburg and Cologne, their members blended seamlessly into legitimate businesses, running restaurants, logistics companies, and construction firms. On the surface, these establishments were ordinary, but behind closed doors, they served as nodes in a vast trafficking network. Germany provided a strategic advantage: its proximity to Rotterdam and Antwerp, two of Europe's busiest ports, where tons of cargo arrived daily from around the world. The sheer volume of goods moving through these ports made them perfect gateways for cocaine. Hidden among containers of bananas, pineapples, or machinery, shipments of white powder made their way onto European soil, often undetected. The Dutch port of Rotterdam in particular became a crown jewel for the Ndrangheta. With millions of containers processed each year, customs officials were overwhelmed, unable to inspect more than a fraction of shipments. The Mafia exploited this weakness with surgical precision, coordinating with corrupt port workers, dockside managers, and logistics companies to ensure that their containers passed smoothly through inspections. In many cases, containers carrying cocaine were tracked with GPS devices, and specialized teams were dispatched to retrieve them quickly before authorities even realized what had entered the country. This operation was so sophisticated that it required multiple layers of coordination, from South American producers who prepared the shipments to European operatives who handled the unloading and distribution. Their expansion didn't stop at logistics. The Ndrangheta understood that control of the cocaine trade required influence not only at the ports, but also across the entire supply chain. They cultivated deep ties with South American cartels, becoming trusted partners who could guarantee both payment and distribution. This trust was not earned overnight. It took decades of careful negotiation, discreet meetings, and a reputation for reliability. Where other European groups might cheat their partners or allow shipments to be intercepted, the Ndrangheta prided itself on discipline. Once a deal was made, it was honored, and this reputation for consistency made them the preferred partners of some of the most powerful cocaine producers in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. In South America, the Ndrangheta's emissaries rarely drew attention to themselves. They did not arrive in lavish cars or with entourages. They moved quietly, posing as businessmen, importers, or investors. Their presence was often invisible to local authorities, and even rival organizations sometimes underestimated their reach. But beneath this facade of normalcy, they were orchestrating one of the most profitable partnerships in the history of organized crime. Each shipment delivered to Europe represented millions of euros in profit, money that was then funneled through an elaborate system of laundering operations. Money laundering became an art form for the Ndrangheta. Billions in cocaine profits needed to be reintegrated into the legal economy, and they achieved this by investing in industries as diverse as real estate, energy, hospitality, and international trade. A single restaurant in Milan might be backed by cocaine money. A construction project in Toronto could be tied to Calabrian clans. Luxury hotels in Spain or resorts in the Caribbean sometimes had silent investors from Calabria, ensuring that illicit profits were cleaned and reinvested into ventures that expanded the Mafia's influence even further. Banks, both local and offshore, became unwitting participants in this scheme, their accounts serving as conduits for funds that were deliberately fragmented and layered to obscure their origins. Even as the Ndrangheta's international operations flourished, their base in Calabria remained central to their identity. The rugged landscape, the ancestral villages, and the culture of secrecy all reinforced their unique strength. No matter how far they expanded, every clan traced its lineage back to Calabria, and loyalty to family remained unshakable. This connection ensured that money flowed back home, supporting communities, funding political campaigns, and cementing the Mafia's authority in the region. For many in Calabria, the Ndrangheta was both a curse and a lifeline, a source of employment and protection, as much as a symbol of fear. Their grip on local politics meant that few dared to oppose them openly. One of the most chilling demonstrations of their international reach came in 2007, when a feud between clans led to the infamous Duisburg massacre in Germany. 6 men were executed outside an Italian restaurant, a brutal reminder that while the Ndrangheta preferred invisibility, they were not afraid to enforce discipline with violence when necessary. The massacre shocked European authorities, who suddenly realized that the Calabrian Mafia was not confined to Italy, but was active and deadly on foreign soil. Yet, even this bloody event did not expose the full extent of their network. Law enforcement agencies soon discovered that the Duisburg incident was merely the tip of the iceberg, a small glimpse into an organization that stretched across continents. In the years that followed, European police forces and prosecutors began devoting more attention to the Ndrangheta. Large-scale operations uncovered vast cocaine pipelines, seizing shipments worth hundreds of millions of euros. But each time authorities celebrated a victory, it became clear that the network was far more resilient than expected. Arrests and seizures barely dented the flow of cocaine. For every container intercepted, dozens more slipped through. For every member imprisoned, new family members rose to take their place, bound by loyalty and blood ties. Unlike other criminal groups that collapsed when leaders were removed, the Ndrangheta's decentralized, family-based structure made it nearly indestructible. As globalization accelerated, so too did the Ndrangheta's opportunities. They tapped into Africa's western ports as alternative routes for smuggling, exploiting weaker law enforcement in countries like Guinea-Bissau to funnel cocaine northward into Europe. They used Spain's long coastline as another entry point, taking advantage of its proximity to North Africa and its role in international shipping. Each route was carefully calculated to reduce risk, ensuring that no single point of failure could disrupt their empire. The diversification of routes and markets meant that even as authorities targeted one channel, others remained open and operational. The reach of the Ndrangheta extended beyond smuggling and logistics. They became experts in forging political connections, offering bribes or support to local officials who could guarantee favorable treatment. In some cases, politicians turned a blind eye to mafia operations in exchange for financial backing or promises of stability. This subtle infiltration of politics and institutions gave the Ndrangheta an added layer of protection, making it even harder for law enforcement to dismantle their networks. By the 2010s, the Ndrangheta had become the undisputed kings of Europe's cocaine trade. Analysts estimated that they controlled as much as 80% of the continent's supply, an extraordinary figure that demonstrated their dominance. Their profits rivaled those of multinational corporations, and their wealth gave them the ability to expand further into sectors of the economy that seemed untouchable. While other mafias had faltered, undone by internal wars, betrayals, or relentless police pressure, the Ndrangheta thrived because of their invisibility. They were everywhere, yet nowhere, always present, but rarely seen. And this is perhaps their greatest weapon. The Ndrangheta understood that power does not always come from being feared in the streets or celebrated in the headlines. True power, for them, came from silence. While journalists wrote endlessly about Sicilian mobsters and American crime bosses, the Calabrian clans quietly amassed fortunes and shaped global markets. They did not need fame, they needed control. And control, carefully maintained through family loyalty, strategic alliances, and relentless patience, made them not just survivors, but rulers of an empire built on white powder. If the smuggling routes were the blood vessels of the Ndrangheta Empire, then money was its heartbeat. Cocaine may have been the product that fueled their rise, but it was the careful management and reinvestment of profits that secured their dominance. A single shipment arriving through Rotterdam or Antwerp could generate tens of millions of euros. Multiply that by the dozens of shipments that made it through each year, and the result was a torrent of cash so vast it could not simply be hidden in safes or buried in fields. The Ndrangheta faced a challenge that few criminal organizations could handle: how to launder and reintegrate billions of euros without drawing attention. Their solution was as brilliant as it was insidious. They became masters of finance, investing so deeply in legitimate industries that their criminal wealth was camouflaged in plain sight. Unlike other mafias that flaunted wealth or relied on intimidation to control businesses, the Calabrian clans approached the economy with patience. Their first priority was always invisibility. Instead of parading luxury cars or building gaudy palaces, they quietly bought controlling shares in small companies. They favored sectors that dealt with cash: restaurants, nightclubs, transport firms, construction companies, businesses that naturally handled large volumes of money and could absorb illicit profits without raising suspicion. In Calabria, entire neighborhoods saw restaurants or pizzerias spring up overnight, some bustling, others empty, but always operating, each serving as a funnel for laundering money. These local businesses gave the clans both legitimacy and influence. They employed locals, earned loyalty from communities, and provided endless opportunities to mask cocaine revenues. But the real genius of the Ndrangheta was their ability to move beyond small enterprises and infiltrate international markets. They exploited globalization with surgical precision. Real estate became a favorite tool. In northern Italy, Spain, and even as far as Canada and Australia, they purchased apartments, hotels, and luxury villas. Each property could be bought in cash through intermediaries or financed with loans repaid quickly using laundered money. Once the property was sold again, the origin of the funds appeared clean, as though it came from legitimate investment. In cities like Milan or Barcelona, some of the most glamorous addresses had silent Calabrian investors behind them. Construction was another vital sector. The Ndrangheta's reputation for infiltrating public works in Calabria is legendary. From road contracts to municipal buildings, they ensured that companies loyal to the clans won tenders, often through intimidation, bribes, or political connections. What began as a local strategy soon spread across Italy and into other parts of Europe. By controlling construction companies, they not only laundered money, but also gained access to lucrative government contracts, sometimes funded by the European Union itself. It was a paradox. The very funds meant to develop and modernize southern Italy occasionally ended up strengthening the mafia that was holding the region back. Their financial empire also stretched into banking, though not in the way most would imagine. The Ndrangheta rarely walked into banks openly. Instead, they cultivated relationships with intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, brokers, who understood how to navigate complex systems. Through these professionals, they accessed offshore tax havens, shell companies, and shadowy networks of financial institutions willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for business. Money was moved in small increments, layered through multiple accounts, and passed through countries with lax oversight. By the time funds resurfaced, they appeared legitimate, ready to be invested in stock markets, energy projects, or technology startups. Their laundering methods were so advanced that even financial experts sometimes struggled to detect irregularities. A single cocaine shipment might be disguised as a series of investments. Part of it funneled into a construction project in Calabria, another portion into a logistics firm in Germany, and the rest hidden in real estate in Spain. By diversifying, they reduced risk and ensured that even if one channel was exposed, the rest remained intact. This adaptability gave them resilience unmatched by most criminal organizations. One of the most disturbing aspects of their economic infiltration was the degree to which they blurred the line between crime and legitimacy. Many businesses controlled by the Ndrangheta operated efficiently, employed workers, and contributed to local economies. In some cases, communities even depended on them. A construction project might provide jobs in a struggling town. A restaurant might become a beloved neighborhood spot. This dual role, criminal and benefactor, created a complex social relationship with the people of Calabria and beyond. To outsiders, it was difficult to tell where Mafia influence ended and ordinary business began. The influence of the Ndrangheta also seeped into politics. With billions at their disposal, they were able to support candidates, fund campaigns, and secure favors from officials. In return, these politicians looked the other way when contracts were awarded to Mafia-linked companies or when suspicious activity was reported. Corruption became both a shield and a weapon. In Calabria, whispers about politicians under Mafia influence were common, but proving such ties was nearly impossible. The very structure of the Ndrangheta, built on family loyalty and silence, meant that outsiders rarely obtained hard evidence. Beyond Italy, their political reach was more subtle but equally effective. In countries like Germany or Canada, where Italian communities were large, the Mafia embedded itself quietly, supporting businesses and occasionally leveraging influence in municipal politics. Unlike in Calabria, where intimidation was overt, abroad they relied on patience and soft power. Their goal was never to draw attention, only to ensure smooth operations and protect their investments. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Ndrangheta's financial empire was its sheer scale. By the 2010 investigators estimated that the organization was generating over 50 billion euros annually, making it one of the wealthiest criminal organizations in the world. To put that into perspective, Its revenues rivaled those of some multinational corporations. With such wealth came the ability to influence not just local economies, but global markets. Their real estate investments alone affected property values in certain cities, while their control of logistics firms allowed them to manipulate supply chains. And yet, despite this staggering financial power, the Ndrangheta remained nearly invisible. Their members rarely flaunted wealth. They avoided the ostentation that had brought down other mafias. No flashy cars, no public displays of extravagance, no hunger for fame. Instead, their leaders lived modestly, blending into the middle class, while their billions circulated quietly in the global economy. This invisibility was not just cultural, but strategic. It ensured that law enforcement agencies often underestimated their true scale. For decades, the Sicilian Mafia was considered Italy's most dangerous criminal group, while the Calabrians operated largely unnoticed. By the time authorities realized the truth, the 'Ndrangheta had already secured an unshakable position. Law enforcement eventually tried to adapt. In Italy, prosecutors launched major investigations, some involving thousands of officers. Raids uncovered businesses, seized assets, and arrested hundreds of suspects. Yet, time and again, the network survived. For every front company that was exposed, several more operated undetected. For every clan member imprisoned, a relative took his place. The structure of the Ndrangheta was designed for survival, and its financial empire proved nearly impossible to dismantle. International cooperation also struggled to keep pace. While European nations pledged to share intelligence and coordinate operations, the complexity of financial crime made progress slow. Different legal systems, varying levels of enforcement, and the global nature of the Ndrangheta's operations meant that investigations often hit dead ends. Even when suspicious funds were identified, tracing them back to Calabria required years of painstaking work, and by then the money had usually moved again. This financial resilience is what makes the 'Ndrangheta perhaps the most successful mafia organization in history. They understood that violence and fear might control neighborhoods, but money controls nations. By embedding themselves into legitimate economies, they became untouchable not because they could not be found, but because removing them would damage the very systems they had infiltrated. How do you dismantle a criminal empire when its profits are propping up local businesses, funding construction projects, and circulating in global markets? That is the question that continues to haunt investigators. As their financial empire grew, so too did their confidence. In Calabria, their presence became almost mythic, a shadow that hung over daily life. In Europe, their reach was acknowledged quietly in boardrooms and political offices, even if rarely discussed publicly. And around the world, their investments continued to spread, weaving a web so intricate that pulling on one strand risked unraveling legitimate businesses along with criminal ones. The 'Ndrangheta had achieved what few criminal organizations ever could. They had become both invisible and indispensable. Their cocaine empire fueled their rise, but it was their mastery of money that secured their future. Every euro laundered, every property purchased, every politician influenced was another brick in the fortress of their power. And while the world continued to chase headlines about cartels and crime lords, the Calabrian Mafia quietly became one of the richest, most influential, and most enduring criminal networks in history. For decades, The Ndrangheta's greatest advantage has been its silence. Where the Sicilian Mafia drew headlines with car bombs and assassinations, and the Neapolitan Camorra flooded the streets with blood to enforce their rule, the Calabrian clans cultivated invisibility. This silence has confounded law enforcement because how do you fight an enemy that leaves almost no trace? By the time European authorities recognized that the Ndrangheta, not the Sicilian Mafia, had become Italy's most powerful criminal organization, the Calabrians were already deeply entrenched in global finance, politics, and trade. The battle to contain them has since become one of the most complex and frustrating challenges for law enforcement. In Calabria itself, prosecutors and investigators have long waged a lonely war. Men like Nicola Gratteri, one of Italy's most famous anti-mafia prosecutors, have spent their careers tracking the clans. Gratteri grew up in Calabria and understood the cultural code that surrounded the Ndrangheta, the silence, the fear, the unspoken loyalties. For years, he pursued cases against them, often at great personal risk, living under constant police protection. His investigations uncovered how the clans controlled cocaine shipments, laundered billions, and infiltrated politics. But even when he secured convictions, the problem remained. The organization was too vast, too resilient, and too deeply embedded in everyday life. Removing individuals did not dismantle the system. It only pruned its branches. Major operations, such as the Ndrangheta Scott trial launched in 2019, demonstrated both the scale of law enforcement efforts and the stubborn resilience of the Ndrangheta. This trial, one of the largest in Italian history, brought more than 300 suspects to court, including politicians, businessmen, and clan members. Courtrooms were converted into fortified bunkers, with hundreds of witnesses testifying. Prosecutors painted a picture of a mafia that was no longer simply a local force, but a global empire stretching across continents. The trial revealed the corruption, intimidation, and infiltration that allowed the Ndrangheta to operate so successfully. Yet even this massive effort barely scratched the surface of their global operations. For every defendant in Calabria, dozens of associates continued working abroad, ensuring that the cocaine trade never paused. Outside of Italy, awareness of the Ndrangheta grew slowly. In Germany, the 2007 Duisburg massacre forced police and politicians to admit that a mafia war had spilled into their streets. Until then, many Germans dismissed the idea that Italian mafias operated in their country at all, assuming organized crime was a foreign problem. Duisburg shattered that illusion, and investigations revealed how deeply the Calabrians had embedded themselves in local communities, especially where Italian immigrant populations were strong. Restaurants, ice cream parlors, and construction firms turned out to be fronts for laundering and logistics. Yet even after Duisburg, authorities struggled to dismantle the networks because they were not built like gangs or cartels. They were built like families, with blood ties that could not be broken by arrests. Toro. One of the greatest obstacles to fighting the Ndrangheta is its structure. Unlike cartels or traditional mafias, which often have visible hierarchies and identifiable leaders, the Calabrian clans operate as a federation of families. Each family controls its own territory and resources, but is linked to others through marriage, alliances, and tradition. This decentralization makes it incredibly difficult to target the organization as a whole. Arrest one boss, and another relative quietly takes his place, seize one company, and others continue to operate undisturbed. The network is designed to survive disruption. Another challenge is the code of silence, omerta. In Calabria, speaking against the Mafia can mean social isolation, economic ruin, or worse. Entire communities depend on the clans for jobs, favors, or protection. Breaking this silence is dangerous, and very few dare to do it. Those who testify often require witness protection, relocation, and constant security. Even abroad, the fear extends across generations. Children raised in Mafia families are taught never to trust outsiders, never to speak openly, and always to protect the clan. This culture of silence has frustrated investigators for decades, making it nearly impossible to gather insider testimony on the scale needed to dismantle the organization. Law enforcement has also faced the problem of globalization. The Ndrangheta is not confined to Calabria or even to Italy. Their operations span Europe, the Americas, Africa, and beyond. Cocaine might leave Colombia, pass through Brazil, enter Europe via Rotterdam, be distributed in Germany, laundered in Spain, and reinvested in Canada. Each step involves different jurisdictions, laws, and enforcement agencies. Coordinating investigations across so many borders is a bureaucratic nightmare. Corruption, inefficiency, and lack of communication between nations often give the Mafia the advantage. By the time one country identifies a suspicious transaction, the money has already moved through 3 others. Yet, despite these challenges, law enforcement has scored some victories. Large cocaine seizures in European ports have disrupted shipments worth hundreds of millions. Coordinated international operations have targeted logistics networks, corrupt port workers, and transport companies. In some cases, undercover agents and wiretaps have exposed critical elements of the supply chain. One investigation in the Netherlands revealed how the clans used encrypted communication systems to coordinate shipments, leading to several arrests and significant seizures. But these victories are often temporary. The Ndrangheta adapts quickly, shifting routes, changing methods, and reinforcing security. For them, losing one shipment is simply a cost of doing business. There is also the issue of perception. Because the Ndrangheta is so invisible, it struggles to capture the public imagination in the way that other mafias do. The Sicilian Mafia became infamous through films, books, and sensational trials. The Colombian cartels were known for their violent reigns and flamboyant leaders. By contrast, the Calabrian clans avoid spectacle. They prefer shadows to headlines. This invisibility means that the public often underestimates the scale of the threat, and without public pressure, governments are slower to act. For years, European nations did not recognize the Ndrangheta as a major concern, allowing the clans to grow unchecked. Still, cracks in the wall of silence are beginning to appear. In recent years, a small but growing number of defectors have come forward. Some younger members, disillusioned with the strict codes of loyalty, have chosen to cooperate with authorities. Their testimonies have revealed details about initiation rituals, cocaine routes, and financial schemes. While these insights are valuable, they remain rare, and the organization continues to rely on its family bonds to prevent widespread betrayal. Technology has also become both a tool and a threat for the Ndrangheta. Encrypted phones and messaging apps have made communication more secure, but they have also given investigators new opportunities when systems are cracked. The dismantling of secure networks like EncroChat revealed thousands of criminal conversations across Europe, including many tied to Calabrian clans. These breakthroughs provided unprecedented glimpses into how shipments were coordinated, bribes arranged, and disputes settled. Yet, as always, the Mafia adapted, shifting to new systems and tightening security protocols. The fight against the Ndrangheta is not just about arrests or cocaine seizures. It is also about dismantling their economic power. European authorities have increasingly focused on asset seizures, targeting real estate companies and bank accounts linked to the clans. Billions of euros worth of assets have been confiscated in Italy and abroad. These efforts strike at the heart of the Mafia's power, its money. But even here, success is partial. For every property seized, countless others remain hidden under layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and silent partners. The financial labyrinth they have built ensures that authorities are always several steps behind. So, can the Ndrangheta ever be broken? The answer is complicated. Traditional law enforcement methods, arrests, trials, seizures, chip away at their strength but rarely deal decisive blows. The organization is too decentralized, too patient, and too embedded in both criminal and legitimate economies. To truly dismantle them would require a sustained international effort, unprecedented cooperation between nations, and a long-term strategy that addresses not just crime, but the social and economic conditions that allow the Mafia to thrive. Poverty, unemployment, and corruption in Calabria provide fertile ground for recruitment, while global demand for cocaine ensures a steady market. Unless these root causes are addressed, the clans will always find a way to adapt and survive. And perhaps this is the most unsettling truth. The Ndrangheta has built an empire not through spectacle, but through patience, loyalty, and silence. They are not chasing fame or recognition. They are chasing permanence. Every shipment, every investment, every alliance is made with the future in mind. While law enforcement celebrates short-term victories, the clans are thinking in terms of decades, even generations. This long view has allowed them to outlast rivals, evade destruction, and quietly build one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. The question now is whether the world can match that patience. Can governments sustain the pressure year after year across borders against an enemy that rarely shows its face? Or will the Ndrangheta continue its silent reign, invisible yet omnipresent, shaping economies and societies without most people ever realizing who truly holds the power? The farther the Ndrangheta stretched its reach, the more it began to seep into the very fabric of everyday life in Europe. Unlike other criminal organizations that often left behind bloody trails of violence or bursts of public notoriety, the Calabrian clans operated like a shadow economy, always present, rarely noticed. By the late 2000s, their money was moving across borders faster than authorities could track, flowing into banks, construction projects, logistics companies, and even restaurants. For the average person buying coffee in Milan or renting an apartment in Frankfurt, it was impossible to know that somewhere along the chain, Ndrangheta cash was helping keep the wheels turning. This financial reach wasn't just about hiding illegal profits. It was about creating permanence. Every euro laundered through a building project or funneled into a transport company gave the clans another anchor in legitimate society. Slowly, they stopped being outsiders, operating from the rugged hills of Calabria, and became silent partners in Europe's mainstream economy. It was a dangerous kind of invisibility. Once criminals are indistinguishable from businessmen, rooting them out becomes nearly impossible. The quiet takeover of the cocaine trade made this infiltration even more effective. By controlling the wholesale market, the Ndrangheta dictated supply and price. They weren't chasing flashy power struggles with rivals. They were building what amounted to a monopoly, but one that remained carefully hidden from public view. For law enforcement, this was frustrating. The absence of turf wars or bodies in the streets meant fewer opportunities to intervene. On paper, everything looked calm, until investigators followed the money and realized just how deep the roots went. At the heart of their strength was family. While other mafias struggled with internal betrayals and defectors, the Ndrangheta's family-first model ensured loyalty. Blood ties were harder to sever, and breaking silence was seen as betraying not just an organization, but your own relatives. This shielded them from the kind of leaks and testimonies that had crippled groups like the Sicilian Cosa Nostra in the past. For decades, prosecutors tried to infiltrate the Calabrian clans, only to find themselves staring at an unbreakable wall of loyalty and silence. The paradox of the Ndrangheta was that their invisibility made them everywhere at once. European ports were under their control. South American cartels trusted them above all others, and billions of euros quietly passed through their hands each year. Yet outside of Italy, their name barely registered in the public imagination. The silence was not accidental. It was strategy, and it worked so well that by the time governments realized the scale of the problem, the Ndrangheta had already cemented itself as Europe's most powerful criminal empire. The cracks in the wall of silence began to appear only when authorities realized that traditional approaches weren't enough. For decades, Italian prosecutors had relied on informants to dismantle mafia families, but the Ndrangheta proved uniquely resistant. With so few willing to betray blood relatives, investigators had to turn to more patient, painstaking methods: wiretaps, undercover financial audits, and international cooperation. What they uncovered shocked even seasoned anti-mafia judges. Operations like Crimin in 2010 revealed that the clans were far more organized than many had assumed. Investigators discovered not just loose family groups, but a coordinated structure stretching across continents, with secret meetings held in Calabria where representatives voted on disputes and strategy. The picture that emerged was of a mafia not just surviving, but thriving as a kind of multinational corporation. Arrests during these operations numbered in the hundreds. Yet even then, the arrests felt like pruning a tree rather than cutting at its roots. One of the key breakthroughs came through financial tracking. European authorities began noticing suspicious movements of capital flowing through seemingly harmless businesses: trucking companies in Germany, real estate in Spain, cafes in the Netherlands. Each thread traced back to Calabrian families. The realization hit hard. While public attention had been focused on the Sicilian Mafia or flamboyant figures like John Gotti in the U.S., the Ndrangheta had built an empire right under everyone's noses. International law enforcement started to coordinate in ways it never had before. Europol and Interpol facilitated cross-border raids, while South American governments began to acknowledge just how deeply the Calabrian clans were embedded in their ports. Container ships arriving from Colombia or Brazil often had one thing in common: Someone connected to the Ndrangheta had overseen their passage. And yet, every victory felt temporary. For every kingpin arrested, another relative quietly stepped into the role. For every drug shipment seized, more slipped through undetected. The problem wasn't just the Mafia itself. It was the demand for cocaine in Europe, which continued to climb steadily. As long as there was profit to be made, the shadow pipeline would never fully close. By the 2010s, prosecutors were describing the Ndrangheta as the single greatest threat to European security, a mafia more entrenched than any before it. But the challenge was daunting. How do you dismantle something that has become both criminal network and legitimate enterprise, both shadow and substance? The battle was no longer just about fighting gangsters. It was about uprooting an invisible empire that had already fused itself with global trade. By the time the Ndrangheta's name began appearing more regularly in international headlines, the damage had already been done. Their influence wasn't confined to smuggling routes or hidden bank accounts. It was creeping into the very institutions meant to safeguard society. Politicians in Calabria were found to have received campaign funding from Mafia-linked businessmen. Contracts for public works quietly flowed toward companies backed by clan money. Even in countries far from Italy, whispers of influence began to surface. The silent takeover wasn't just economic, it was political. The strategy was subtle but devastating. Unlike cartels in Latin America that used open violence to intimidate governments, the Ndrangheta preferred a quieter form of leverage. They bought influence in small increments. A contract here, a donation there, a favor granted in exchange for silence. For communities desperate for jobs or investment, refusing mafia-backed money wasn't always a realistic option. The line between necessity and corruption blurred, and over time, the clans became invisible stakeholders in the civic life of entire regions. In northern Italy, their presence could be seen in construction booms and nightlife districts. In Germany, their money flowed into restaurants and logistics firms. In Spain, it blended seamlessly with the bustling real estate market. They had become part of Europe's economic engine, reshaping the continent not with bombs or bloodshed, but with contracts and investments. Few citizens realized that the glass of wine they drank in a Milanese bar or the apartment block rising on the coast of Valencia might be tied, however distantly, to Calabrian crime families. But with influence came consequences. Where the Ndrangheta operated, corruption deepened. Local businesses unable to compete with mafia-backed firms found themselves edged out. Young people in Calabria who might have dreamed of leaving poverty behind were often faced with two options: work for the clans or struggle against them. Even beyond Italy, communities began to feel the weight of invisible corruption. Cities that prided themselves on law and order found that mafia networks had already woven themselves into the supply chains of their economies. For law enforcement, the challenge was no longer simply about intercepting cocaine shipments. It was about protecting democratic institutions from erosion. Each time an election was influenced by mafia money or a public project was steered into criminal hands, faith in the system took another hit. The Ndrangheta had reshaped society not through terror, but through quiet infiltration. And perhaps the most chilling part was this: the majority of Europe still didn't know their name. While movies and series glamorized Sicilian dons and American mobsters, the true power players of the modern era operated without fame, without drama, and often without a trace. Invisibility had become their ultimate weapon. The turning point came not from a single arrest or raid, but from a slow accumulation of voices refusing to stay silent. Investigative journalists in Italy began publishing detailed reports on the Calabrian clans, tracing their connections across borders. Small local newspapers in Calabria risked intimidation and threats to shine light on the families that had long dominated their communities. Step by step, the veil of invisibility began to thin. One of the most effective tools in this fight was collaboration between reporters and prosecutors. Where official investigations stalled, journalism kept pressure alive. Stories exposing mafia influence in construction contracts or public spending made it harder for politicians to pretend ignorance. International media outlets eventually picked up on these investigations, amplifying the message that the Ndrangheta was no longer just an Italian problem, it was a European one. Inside the organization itself, cracks also began to form. A small number of defectors, once thought impossible, chose to break omerta and cooperate with authorities. Their testimonies confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The Ndrangheta wasn't a scattered group of families acting independently, but a cohesive network with rules, rituals, and centralized decision-making. Each defection provided prosecutors with pieces of a puzzle that had seemed unsolvable for decades. Law enforcement began to adapt as well. Traditional mafia fighting strategies gave way to new methods focused on financial intelligence. Rather than waiting for violent outbreaks, police forces tracked suspicious transactions, cross-checked corporate records, and mapped networks of shell companies. International task forces were set up, linking police in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, and even South America. Slowly the picture of the Ndrangheta's empire came into focus. But exposing them carried risk. Journalists who wrote too boldly faced intimidation, vandalism, or worse. Prosecutors lived under constant threat, their movements restricted, their families forced to live with protection. Even politicians who took strong anti-mafia stances found themselves targeted by smear campaigns and financial sabotage. The clans wanted to remind anyone watching that their power, though quiet, was far from harmless. Yet the curtain was being pulled back. For the first time, ordinary Europeans began to hear the name Ndrangheta on the news. The idea that an invisible mafia controlled much of the cocaine entering the continent was shocking, and it challenged assumptions that organized crime was a relic of the past. Instead, it was revealed as something alive, modern, and dangerously sophisticated. The silence that had protected the Calabrian clans for so long was finally being broken. But as investigators and journalists would soon learn, exposing the Ndrangheta was only the beginning. Bringing them down was another matter entirely. The most ambitious strike against the Ndrangheta came in the form of massive trials that shook Italy and reverberated across Europe. In 2021, prosecutors launched the largest mafia trial in decades, gathering hundreds of defendants in a specially built courtroom in Calabria. Politicians, businessmen, police officers, and clan members alike were forced to stand before judges accused of helping build or sustain the invisible empire. It was a spectacle meant to remind the public and the clans that no one was untouchable. The evidence laid out was staggering. Wiretaps captured secret meetings where bosses discussed drug shipments. Financial records traced laundered money through seemingly respectable companies. Testimonies from defectors revealed rituals of initiation, codes of loyalty, and the internal rules that bound the organization together. For the first time, the inner workings of the Ndrangheta were being documented not in whispers or speculation, but in court. And yet, even with such a historic trial, the outcome was uncertain. History had shown that Mafia structures were remarkably resilient. Even if dozens of members were convicted, the family-based system meant replacements could step in. Each branch of the clan was like a root. Cut one, and the others continued to grow beneath the surface. Authorities knew that victory would not come from a single operation, but from a sustained, decades-long effort. Meanwhile, the cocaine trade itself showed no signs of slowing down. Demand across Europe remained high, and South American cartels still viewed the Calabrian clans as their most trusted partners. For every container seized in Rotterdam or Antwerp, many more slipped through, feeding a billion-euro market that no police force could ever fully contain. The reality was sobering. As long as the demand existed, the pipeline would remain open. Still, the trials and investigations marked a turning point. For the first time, the Ndrangheta could no longer count on silence to shield them. Their name was now known across Europe. Governments began prioritizing resources against them. Citizens, too, grew more aware that organized crime wasn't something distant or old-fashioned. It was shaping the world around them in ways they rarely saw. The story of the Ndrangheta is not one of flashy violence or cinematic drama. It is the story of power built on patience, invisibility, and silence. A mafia that learned how to thrive by avoiding the spotlight, embedding itself in economies and institutions until it became nearly impossible to separate crime from legitimacy. Their rise was a silent takeover, one that reshaped Europe's underworld and challenged the very idea of what organized crime looks like in the modern age. And as this chapter of history continues to unfold, one chilling truth remains. The most dangerous mafia isn't always the one you see. Sometimes it's the one you don't. The Ndrangheta story is proof that real power doesn't always announce itself with headlines or violence. Sometimes it moves quietly, slipping into the cracks of society until it's everywhere and nowhere at once. Their silent takeover of Europe's cocaine trade isn't just about crime. It's about how invisible forces can shape economies, politics, and even daily life without us noticing. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of history's hidden empires. And remember, sometimes the darkest stories are the ones hiding in plain sight. Good night. Asterisk.